Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Okay, right, so we've discussed that amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, is this neurodegenerative disease in which both the lower motor neurons and the upper motor neurons are going to degenerate. Now, in order to fully understand what that means, we need to have a good understanding of the corticospinal tracts and the corticobulbar tracts. Okay, so we've just discussed the corticospinal tract. Now what I want to do is discuss the corticobulbar tract. Now the corticobulbar tract is this projection of upper motor neurons down from the primary motor cortex to nuclei of cranial nerves that are in the brainstem. Bulbar specifically refers to in the pons. Now, not all of the cranial nerve nuclei are going to be in the pons, okay, but they're around there, okay, so that's the reason that the name sort of makes sense. Okay, right, so I'm not going to discuss all of the different cranial nerves with a motor component in them, okay? What I'm going to do is pick one cranial nerve and use that to demonstrate the principles, because the principle is exactly the same for all of the cranial nerves that have a motor component, okay? But I don't want to go through absolutely all of them. It's not necessary. To get the principle across, we only need to see one. Okay, and the one that we're going to use is the trigeminal nerve, okay, which is also known as cranial nerve 5. Okay, right, so, firstly, let me say that just like in the case of the corticospinal tract, where the fibers crossed sides, okay, before innervating lower motor neurons, it's going to be the same in the case of the cranial nerve nuclei, okay? So, if I get this picture back again, remember, in the case of the rest of the body, it was the case that muscles on the left-hand side, they were innervated by lower motor neurons which had their cell bodies in the left ventral root horn, okay? But those lower motor neurons were innervated by upper motor neurons which had their cell bodies up on the right primary motor cortex, okay, and then they crossed at some point on the descending pathway, okay. Then for the right half of the body, again, skeletal muscle cells on the right half of the body were innervated by lower motor neurons which had their cell bodies in the right ventral root horn. However, those lower motor neurons were then innervated by upper motor neurons which had their cell bodies up in the left primary motor cortex. The same is going to be true with the cranial nerve nuclei, okay? The cranial nerve nuclei are going to contain lower motor neurons, okay, which are going to stay on the same side as that nucleus and innervate muscles on the same side of the body as the nucleus, okay? However, they're going to be innervated by upper motor neurons which are going to have their cell bodies in the opposite side at primary motor cortex. So, let me show this. So, firstly what I'm going to do is redraw this picture that we've drawn here of the brainstem, okay, because the corticobulbar tract is going to run alongside the corticospinal tract, okay. The corticobulbar axons are going to be coming along with these corticospinal fibers. They're just going to be coming out of these bundles, whilst the corticospinal neurons will be going onwards basically through the entire thing. Okay, so the corticobulbar fibers are just going to be coming out basically at some point. Okay, right, so I'm going to draw that picture of the brainstem from the ventral view again. Okay, so remember when we look at the brainstem from the ventral view, we see the front of the midbrain where we're looking at the two cerebral peduncles head on now. Okay, so there's the right cerebral peduncle, and now here is the left cerebral peduncle here. Okay, and then as we go backwards, we see the superior colliculus here. Okay, that's the right superior colliculus, and then the left superior colliculus here. Okay, so there's the midbrain, and then underneath the midbrain, you're then going to have the pons, the next major portion. Okay, here, and then underneath the pons, you're then going to have the medulla. Okay, now we're not really going to need the medulla in this discussion, but I'll put it there anyway. Okay, so there's the medulla. Right, so let's now add on the pathway that these fibers then take. Okay, so we're now talking about corticobulbar fibers, however they run along with the corticospinal fibers. Okay, so let me redraw on this pathway that we've seen the corticospinal fibers take. So firstly I'm demarcating the crus cerebri, which remember is the ventral portion of the cerebral peduncles, and then the middle third of the crus cerebri is where these corticospinal and corticobulbar fibers will be running. Okay, like so. So all the corticobulbar fibers are going to come through this middle 1/3 of the crus cerebri along with all the corticospinal fibers. Okay, this portion that I'm now highlighting in green. So they've all come through here, and now what I'm going to draw is that bundle of fibers that passes through the pons again. Okay, so remember this is not visible from the exterior, okay, because it's running down through the middle. Okay, so once again I'll show it in dashed lines, like so. And then, of course, if we're talking about the corticospinal fibers, they will then go into the pyramids of the medulla, which will be below here. Okay, but we're not going to need those, so I won't draw those on. Okay, so here then are the corticospinal fibers going all the way down, but the corticobulbar fibers are going to be running in this as well, and they're going to be coming out early, basically. Okay, at least they're going to be coming out early to go to the trigeminal motor nucleus. For other cranial nerve nuclei, they will be coming out at different levels, basically, along the length of the corticospinal tract. Okay, right. So, let me discuss with you a little bit about the trigeminal nerve then, firstly. Okay, so you have two trigeminal nerves. You have a left trigeminal nerve and a right trigeminal nerve. Okay, and they come out from the front of the pons. Okay, so they're very, very noticeable. If you ever do see in dissection or prosection class a pons, then you will most likely be able to see the trigeminal nerves coming out from the front. Okay, so here they are. Okay, so this one is the left, and I'll just call it cranial nerve 5 for shortness. Okay, now what happens is cranial nerve 5 splits into 3 different portions. Okay, yes, firstly you have the trigeminal ganglion, but I'm not going to bother drawing that. Okay, that's just confusing the point. The point is that the trigeminal nerve splits into 3 separate nerves, and it does this on both sides. I won't bother drawing it for this side, but it's doing it on that side as well. Now, these 3 separate nerves then, what are they called? Well, the first one is called 5A, okay, cranial nerve 5A, and its proper name is the ophthalmic nerve, okay, or the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. Okay, next one is 5B, and again, it has a proper name. It's also known as the maxillary nerve. Okay, and the final one down here is 5C, and again, it has a proper name. Its proper name is the mandibular nerve. Now, the one which has motor neurons that are going to skeletal muscle fibers is 5C, the mandibular nerve. Both the left mandibular nerve, as shown here, and also the right mandibular nerve. Okay, so that's the component of the trigeminal nerve where our motor neurons, our lower motor neurons, are going to go down. Okay, now what does this nerve innervate? It innervates the muscles of mastication, okay, which are the muscles responsible for chewing, okay? So mastication means chewing, okay? I know it sounds like something else, but it does mean chewing. So, the mandibular nerve is going to innervate the muscles of mastication. Okay, so, in the pons then, there is a nucleus which contains all the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons that are going to go to the muscles of mastication via the mandibular nerve. Okay, and you're going to, of course, have 2 of these nuclei. You're going to have a left one, which I'll put here, and a right one, which I'll put here. And I'm sorry, one's much bigger than the other. That wasn't intentional. I'll fix it with the colouring, okay? By colouring it in, I can make this one bigger now. Okay, so here we are in blue. These 2 nuclei are the motor nuclei of cranial nerve 5. Okay, and make sure you call them the motor nuclei. That's important. 5 is a massive great nerve. Okay, it has a lot of nuclei. Okay, this is specifically the place where the motor neurons of the trigeminal nerve are, and hence it needs to be called the motor nuclei of cranial nerve 5. And of course, actually, I've only put an arrow to one of them. That would be the left motor nucleus of cranial nerve 5, so I'll make sure I've got arrows to both of them since I put the plural there. Okay, right. So this nucleus, or rather these nuclei, are going to contain lower motor neurons that are going to send their axons into the ipsilateral trigeminal nerve and then going into the mandibular nerve to innervate the muscles of mastication. Okay, right. So then the upper motor neurons that are going to be innervating these lower motor neurons, those are going to come from the contralateral side, basically. Okay, so the corticobulbar fibers are going to be coming from the opposite side. So for instance, corticobulbar fibers on the right hand side here are now going to be innervating the left motor nucleus of the cranial nerve 5. So let me put this in here. Like so. So some of these fibers will be crossing over from the right corticobulbar tract here into the left motor nucleus of cranial nerve 5. Okay, now I'd just like to give you a transverse section of the pons so that I can show you in more detail where the motor nucleus of cranial nerve 5 actually is. Okay, so if we take a transverse section of the pons then, remember you see the middle cerebellar peduncles at the back, like so, and then here is the front of the pons here. Now, the motor nuclei of cranial nerve 5 are right at the back of the pons, almost in the middle cerebellar peduncles here. So these are the structures that we are seeing here. Okay, that's just to show you where they are, because at the moment it looks as though they're sticking out from the front of the pons, but in fact they're right at the back here. Okay, and they will be sending fibers into the trigeminal nerves, which will be right at the front here. Okay, like so. Okay, and the fibers, the lower motor neurons, will be going into the ipsilateral, the same side nerve, basically. Okay, just like in the spinal cord, where lower motor neurons in the left ventral root horn go into spinal nerves on the left side, like so. Okay, it's exactly the same up in the case of the cranial nerves. And then the upper motor neurons are the ones that cross from the opposite side to innervate the motor nucleus on the other side. Okay, right. So that basically is the basic principle of the Corticobulbar Tract, that you have these upper motor neurons sending their axons down to innervate contralateral lower motor neurons in cranial nerve nuclei, basically, which are on the contralateral side, basically. Okay, and then those lower motor neurons are going to go out in some cranial nerve to innervate skeletal muscle cells. Okay, right. So, now we've discussed the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tracts. We're ready to put it all together. We have a very good understanding now, I hope, of the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons, and how they work together to deliver the motor plan which the secondary motor cortex has devised out to the skeletal muscles, basically. Okay, right. So in ALS, okay, what's going to happen is you're going to get degeneration of the upper motor neurons and the lower motor neurons. Okay, so this doesn't just occur overnight, it is a gradual process. Okay, now in the early stages where just a few upper and just a few lower motor neurons have gone, then you end up just with muscle weakness. Okay, your ability to contract your muscles is reducing, basically. Okay, so in the early stages, remember, you end up with weakness. Okay, and that's illustrated generally by you dropping objects. You also end up with difficulty in performing fine tasks, again because you're losing the ability to control the contraction of your skeletal muscle. Okay, right, and then in the later stages, as it progresses and you lose more and more upper and lower motor neurons, okay, what ends up happening is you lose complete control of your skeletal muscles, and therefore you lose the ability to make voluntary movements because you can no longer contract your skeletal muscles voluntarily. Okay, now because the skeletal muscle now is not being used, okay, it's not receiving any instructions anymore from lower motor neurons, what ends up happening is you end up getting atrophy of the skeletal muscle cells, okay, and that neurogenic atrophy is known as amyotrophy, okay, and that's what the entire syndrome is named after. Okay, right, and then of course later on what will then happen is you'll lose the ability to contract your diaphragm because your diaphragm is skeletal muscle. It's innervated by lower motor neurons that run in the phrenic nerve, and when that gets to the point that it's no longer capable of contracting significantly enough to bring in sufficient air to supply your tissues with enough oxygen, okay, then you get respiratory failure and that kills you. Okay, right. Now the final thing that I want to explain then is the lateral sclerosis. Okay, remember it's amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Okay, so why do you get this lateral sclerosis of the spinal cord? Okay, so basically the lateral sclerosis occurs because of a phenomenon known as a gliosis. Okay, now in a gliosis you get a large division of glia. Okay, now specifically in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, the gliosis involves cells known as astrocytes. Okay, so I just want to give a little bit of insight into what astrocytes are. So astrocytes are a type of cell that you find in the central nervous system, so in the brain and the spinal cord. And basically their job is to look after neurons. Okay, so let me draw a picture of what they look like. So they're star-shaped cells. Okay, like so. They have lots of these little processes sticking out from them. Here is their nucleus here. And their job is to look after the neurons. Okay, and one of the key ways that they do this is by making sure that the extracellular fluid, the ECF, which the neurons are bathed in, is a fantastic place for the neurons to actually live. Okay, so they make sure that it's full of nice nutrients for the neurons. They make sure that the ionic balance is all correct, okay? They make sure basically that the extracellular fluid doesn't contain anything nasty which is going to harm the neurons, and that instead it's just the right temperature, and well, not literally just the right temperature, but I mean it's just right, it's perfect for neurons, and it's their job to maintain that basically. Okay, so they look after it. They don't actually regulate the temperature as far as I'm aware. That was just a comparison to Goldilocks. Okay, right. They keep the environment for the neurons nice. Okay, now they're also involved in the scarring and repair process that occurs in the central nervous system when neurons die. Okay, so if you get a large amount of neural tissue dying, okay, what handles the scarring and repair process? Well, astrocytes are involved in that. Okay, so remember, in amyotrophic lateral sclerosis we are losing lower motor neurons and upper motor neurons. Now let me draw you a picture of the spinal cord again. So I'll draw you a cross section of the spinal cord. Okay, like so. So here is the anterior median fissure, here is the posterior median sulcus, and then the grey matter is in this shape like so, in this sort of butterfly-like shape. Now remember, where did the corticospinal tract run? Well, most of the corticospinal tract on the level of the spinal cord was in the lateral corticospinal tracts. Okay, so I'll draw these here. So here is the right lateral corticospinal tract, and here is the left corticospinal tract, which were in the lateral columns. Okay, sorry, left lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, now, if the upper motor neurons are degenerating, then you're going to get huge loss of axons running in these lateral corticospinal tracts, because if the upper motor neurons are gone, then the axons that run down in these portions are going to go. Okay, and what's going to happen is that astrocytes are going to invade these areas and proliferate, so you're going to end up with loads and loads of astrocytes in these places, particularly these places, because that's where the neurodegeneration is going to be most prominent. I know there are also the anterior corticospinal tracts, but remember those are much smaller than the lateral corticospinal tracts. Okay, so you're going to get lots of astrocytes proliferating in these areas, okay, which are in the lateral areas of the spinal cord. Okay, and this is what causes the hardening of the lateral portion of the spinal cord. The presence of loads of astrocytes causes it to feel harder, basically, and that's where the lateral sclerosis originates from. Okay, so now we understand fully why this disease is known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Okay, so we'll call it there for this video, and in the next video we will turn our attention to the neurodegenerative process that underlies this disease.